You know, in firearms training, we often talk about finger discipline and muzzle control, but do we talk about brain discipline and neurology and the neurology behind how we make decisions when we go out on the range or when we're engaged in active combat? Today, we try to tackle that topic with Dustin Salomon of Building Shooters, so stay with us.
You are a warrior.
321 status. What kind of vehicle is it?
You are the very best your nation has to offer.
911. Multiple shots fired.
They're asking you to lead.
5. We need a Bearcat.
It's up to us.
So 133, I need somebody that's got a visual on where the shooter is.
You must be sound in mind, body, and spirit.
42, where's the officer down? I have a rescue helicopter that wants to land and help.
This is the podcast that will make you the one.
Copy, running eastbound.
The one that will bring everyone back.
Trouble, we have shots fired.
Give me back up now.
Because no one else is coming.
I'm going to have an officer shot, 100 block of East Street.
Suspect is down.
This is The Squad Room.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Squad Room Podcast, the place for cops who want to create more resilience, improve their work-life balance, and attack each day with positivity and a passion for the work that we do. On this show, we cover the tactics and strategies that you can use every day to create a life worth living both in and out of uniform. My name is Garrett Teslaw, and I'm a full-time sergeant for a sheriff's office in Southern California, and I'm on a mission to build a world where first responders wake up inspired, feel confident at work, and go home safe, knowing they've spent their time in a worthy cause. Before we get to our guest today, I want to remind you of a few things. First, if you're on social media, make sure you're following us at The Squad Room and that you've liked our Facebook page, and you can also join our Facebook group. Just search The Squad Room group to join. But most importantly is that you head over to thesquadroom.net and get signed up for our mailing list. People on that list get exclusive access to free resource downloads and a weekly newsletter that I send out, and a lot of content that's exclusive to that list, so don't miss out on something that can help you in your life or your career. So join us at thesquadroom.net. All right, my guest today is Dustin Salomon, a former naval officer and founder of Building Shooters Technology, a small business dedicated to driving fundamental change in the firearms and tactical training industry. Now, Dustin, between his military time and his contracting time in the private sector, he's conducted over 20 overseas deployments. And he's a founding member and director of training for Sealed Mindset, which I guess is now called Defensive Mindset Training, and has spoken on the application of brain science to firearms training design at the FBI Firearms Instructor Conference and the Georgia Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors Conference. He's got several books on the topic. He's quite the prolific writer on this stuff of neuroscience and the biology of the brain and how we learn in neuroplasticity in terms of firearms training. He's got a bunch of books on the topic. You can definitely check out his stuff there. His texts have been used in training development by numerous law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and the New York State Department of Criminal Justice. He's a certified law enforcement firearms instructor in multiple disciplines, and he's designed the weapons training programs for multiple military commands. He's got a Bachelor's of Science from the U.S. Naval Academy, a Master's in Security Management, and like I said, he's got a ton of books. The one that we talk about most today is Building Shooters, which is also where you can find him online. A lot of great lessons today. We don't cover firearms on the Squad Room very often. Obviously, it's a very important part of the job. Obviously, it's a topic that is something that needs to be discussed. But to be honest, there are people out there that are far more better. Is that even a phrase? I speak English good. There are people who are far more qualified to talk about firearms than me. My experience with firearms started in the academy, and obviously it's something I maintain and I want to be proficient on and good at, but it is not the kind of topic that I typically live and breathe, which is why this conversation today with Dustin is so great. I joke sometimes that if I wanted to have a really popular podcast, I'd just talk about firearms all the time because it's a popular topic. And for obvious reasons, it's an interesting topic for many, but it's just not in my expert wheelhouse in terms of all the nuances and minutia that goes into firearms, and particularly designing a firearms course of firearms training, which is why people like Dustin are so great. Another podcast I can't recommend enough, if you're looking for stuff specific to firearms, is Firearms Nation, which is hosted by Arik Levy out there in Florida. Arik is a great podcast host. He goes way into the weeds on firearm stuff, and he's also a deputy sheriff out there. I've been on his show and hope to have him on here soon. So definitely check out like a show like Firearms Nation if you want to go way deep onto firearms training consistently. But here on the Squad Room, we'll try to cover an umbrella approach to a lot of these topics. And it's just not something we get too often, but I haven't done one in a while. And it's taken some time for me to get back to the range because of some injuries and whatnot and some time and the holidays. And so I thought it was a good chance to bring Dustin on to, help me reframe some of my questions and some of my beliefs around firearms training and also challenge some of those ways that we've always done things. So it's a great interview today with Dustin Salomon of Building Shooters. When we think about the equipment we carry with us on our person, we often assume that it's our sidearm that's the most important. But I disagree. Sure, it's important. But think about how important your radio is and how often you use it. Statistically, you're likely to go your entire career without ever firing your sidearm. However, you won't go more than a few minutes in patrol without using your radio. It's your lifeline to the outside world. It's how we call for help, set up a perimeter, request an ambulance, or maybe a supervisor. And think about it. If you do end up using your sidearm on duty, it's very likely that the next thing you'll use is your radio to tell dispatch shots fired. Our radios are incredibly important to our jobs and to help keep us and our partners safe. And it's important to make sure that you're using quality equipment. We can't control the quality of the radio we're issued by our department, but we can often control some of the accessories that we use to make them better and make us safer. I'm proud that ComGear Supply is a sponsor of this episode. Head over to ComGearSupply.com and you will see their massive inventory of microphones, earpieces, speakers, batteries, headsets, push-to-talk sets, and everything else you need to help you stay in comms and stay safe. Their customer service team will help you make sure you get the right accessories compatible with your system. Now here's the coolest part about ComGear Supply and why I'm so proud that they work with us. They have a line of duty protection warranty on many of their products. Yeah, that's right. If your gear ever breaks in the line of duty, they'll replace it. And prices are tax-free, and it's always free shipping on orders inside the U.S. and even to some parts of Canada. Go to ComGearSupply.com right now and use that coupon code THESQUADROOM to get 10% off your order. Make sure you also follow them on Instagram at ComGearSupply and let them know that you appreciate their support of the show. This episode is sponsored by OfficerPrivacy.com. In the age of the internet, social media, and smartphones, there's so much amazing information out there that's at our fingertips. I can research any topic or person I want to and learn all about them, their family, and way more information than I really should be able to. The problem is people can do that same research on us too. Whether we like it or not, our information is on the internet, out there for people to find. Just accepting this and doing nothing isn't an option. We as cops have a giant target on our back these days. I don't know if you noticed, but it's kind of rough out there. Sometimes that's literally a target, and it's life or death. And other times it's just dealing with potential harassment. Either way, we don't want to expose our families to those risks. Being careful about what you post on social media, that doesn't go far enough. It's easy for a bad guy with an iPhone and free Wi-Fi to hunt you down. That's why OfficerPrivacy.com exists. My friend Pete James is the founder, and he spent 25 years in law enforcement here in California, using much of his career to hunt down criminals and evidence on computers and on the internet. Pete knows how easy it is to find you, and since he's one of the good guys, he can help. OfficerPrivacy.com offers 2 packages to choose from to help you clean up your side of the internet. Their premium service, the one I use, allows you to sit back and let the professionals do the work where they will work to scrub the internet's top 30 people search sites that can expose your home address. Then they will work to maintain your privacy by monitoring those same sites. If you show up again, they'll remove you again. And here's the thing that other privacy companies don't tell you. You will show up again. It's impossible to keep your stuff off the internet just that one time. It takes constant diligence. That's why their team is so helpful. They do it for you. Now, they also offer an at-home solution for those of you that have the time and technical ability to do it yourself. Using their proprietary software, you can remove yourself and your family members from these same top 30 people search sites on the internet, and then use their software to conduct audits as often as you'd like to make sure you haven't gotten added back yet. To learn more about how you can keep safe, check them out at officerprivacy.com/thesquadroom. When you sign up through that link, you'll get a free USB data blocker, and your first month of monitoring is free. That's officerprivacy.com/thesquadroom. Dustin Salomon of Building Shooters, welcome to the Squadroom. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
You have some fans of notable reputation who are big fans of your work, including Kyle Lamb and Dr. Bill Lewinsky and so many others. to say you're from Building Shooters, that kind of scratches the surface. You're also the author of Hitting in Combat, The Brain Science of Training to Win Gunfights, and also Building Shooters, the book, applying neuroscience research to tactical training systems and design. And I mentioned right before we hit record that I'm kind of going off into the weeds on my own exploration of all things neurology these days. So the idea of firearms training and coupling that with neurology was really interesting to me. And when I came across your work, thought that this would be a great conversation for our cops to have in terms of how their brain, because we're learning so much about how their brain is affected by sleep deprivation, affected by trauma, affected by hypervigilance, affected by all these different things: diet, nutrition, exercise, et cetera, et cetera. But other than like Colonel Grossman's work on the science behind killing, I haven't come across somebody who's applied neuroscience and neurobiology to firearms training. So I'm excited to have this conversation. So tell people about yourself and what you did before, but also your transition into becoming the type of firearms instructor that you are.
Yeah. Well, like I said, thanks for having me. So for everybody in the audience, if you haven't figured it out, I'm not a cop. No law enforcement experience, which usually begs the immediate question: why should we be listening to anything this dude has to say? So my background is military, and what kind of led me into this path I'm following now, or the research that I started doing, was a combination of situations where I was at a couple different Navy commands. And just to keep the story very short, I had some shooting experience that I got when I was at the Naval Academy, through being on one of a practical shooting team there. And so I got into the fleet. I was sort of in the unique position of having a technical skill that was all of a sudden became relevant and hadn't been. So I got in the fleet right after the USS Cole, or I guess right before the USS Cole attack. And so the Navy hadn't taken firearms training seriously at all for several decades prior to that. And all of a sudden it became a big deal. And so I was one of at least where I was at, one of the few people that really had some in-depth knowledge of that. And so I was the guy that was building the firearms training programs at the next, two commands that I was at. And so the first place I was at probably would be very familiar to most of the listeners, where I didn't have range access, I didn't have any ammunition, and didn't have access to any of the people I was supposed to train. And so what I ended up doing was putting together a dry fire program, which I taught an hour at a time, starting with just teaching people to load and unload the gun. So I left there, didn't really think what I did was good training. Went to what is now was the first active component of what is now the Expeditionary Warfare training group, I think is what it's called. Anyway, it was called, at the time it was called Mobile Security, and I was the plank owning operations officer for one of the security detachments, and was able to put together what we would consider more of a traditional shooting package at that command. And all of my guys, or not all of them, but the vast majority of them were already military policemen. And so they'd already been, qualified as military policemen before they came to the command. They all went through between 5 and 6 weeks of weapons training when they're at the command. And then I got them for what was supposed to be an advanced weapons training block, and realized very quickly that most of the sailors did not have a consistent grip on their handgun. So that really was it was kind of a slap in the face to me, going, we've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort, not that it's been done in the most efficient manner, but there's been enough of it that even if it wasn't efficient, it should have worked, and it didn't. And these guys are not that different than the sailors on the ship, who basically had no resources at all. And so that kind of really got me interested in how people learn, what the impacts of our training methodology is, and looking at that part of the industry that I'm from, which is part of the industry that most armed professionals are from, which is not the halo jumping out of planes and spend 2.5 years in training before you go on your first operation. Most people aren't there, and most people are in the, I don't have enough resources, I don't have enough training, and I'm getting sent to do the job anyway because I'm the guy that's there. And so it's really that part of the industry that, or that part of the set of armed workforces or whatever that I particularly have an interest in, because that's my particular background. Anyway, so jumping ahead a bunch of years, I went into the overseas contracting thing after I got out of the Navy, and so I had the opportunity to both see how training impacted my own operational performance and training performance, and also see how different people's training backgrounds impacted their operational performance and their performance in training. So working with everybody from legitimate guys with a whole career doing tier 1 work to third country nationals that barely spoke English, third grade education, and could barely pass the weapons qual, and kind of everything in between. So it's a really good opportunity to get a very broad spectrum of what armed workforces look like, from sort of all across the industry. And so when I'd be back from deployment, I would always grab a student or two and be like, hey, you interested in learning the shoot? All right, let's go to the range, or let's work on this. And I was trying to tweak the training methods that I put together on the ship. So I guess, I don't know, took a brief time out, tried to start a business with a buddy of mine, doing training up in Minneapolis. That business is actually still going. It's called Defensive Mindset Training, up in the New Hope area. We ran out of money before we kind of figured out a commercial formula, so I went back overseas, and then had the opportunity to run a class for a friend of mine who was a research neuroscientist with the Air Force Research Laboratory, and moved out to a rural area and wanted to do a shotgun class. So I went out and I did a shotgun class for her, and she was like, what you're doing in terms of training methodology and application is actually some pretty cutting edge stuff in the neuroscience field, which I had no idea. And she's like, here, go look up a couple of subjects. And so I set about to write myself a 10 or 15 page paper after a week of research. And about 4 years later, I had some 200 pages and eventually published that as Building Shooters. And so that's kind of how all this got started, was looking at this just tremendous inefficiency and ineffectiveness of how we run entry-level training, and looking at how we can do that better. And so what I had kind of discovered along the way, particularly once I got into looking at the neurology, is that basically what I discovered was what I call the first fundamental failure of training. And obviously my background is kind of in the tactical firearms realm, but this is just how the brain learns. It's not specific to firearms, right? It can be for basically everything that you need to learn. Is that our methods of training delivery are completely mismatched with how the brain receives, stores, and then later accesses information. And so that was for me, one of the really big aha moments, is just kind of looking at this roadmap of how the brain works, which is really what the first book, Building Shooters, is. It's a terrain map of the brain that explains how it learns and is applied specifically to firearm stuff. But the information is applicable to any subject. Does that kind of get me through the introduction there?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think any cop listening is probably chuckling at the idea that you had a shared experience that we all have of no time, money, or resources, especially when it comes to range time and ammo and all those sorts of things. And the assumption, I think, at least for the cops who haven't served in the military or in the fleet or in those areas of lack, is that the military gets everything that they want. And so, it's I don't know if humorous is the right word. It was kind of humorous to hear that you struggled with that same idea and that same concept, and that even your MPs did not have the resources or the skills that they really needed to do their job safely and effectively as well. What was it that prompted you to first start putting together the connection between the brain and the trigger finger?
Yeah, so that was going and running. I mean, obviously, we all know the brain has something to do with your performance, right?
Sure.
But in terms of actually looking at the neurology, and my specific focus or my specific interest is really around the training system side. Um, so there's a lot of folks out there, sports and whatever, who are very focused on, well, I'll call that elite level performance. You go search that, you can find a gazillion books on it. Like a Peak is a book. There's guys working on the whole flow state thing. Guys have probably read some of those books. So there's a lot of focus in the industry, and not just our industry, right? But any industry that is focused on elite level performance. And I kind of like to describe it this way, at least in the shooting world, right? Like today, maybe not the case 25 years ago, but today, anybody can get access to enough information about the skills and how to train or whatever, that your average person can spend a couple $1,000s, decide this is what they want to do, spend 2-3 hours a day, and chase being a really, really good world-class shooter, right? They may not catch Rob Latham, but they can chase Rob Latham, right? Everybody can do that. But that's a question of individual decision, putting in the time. But it's not a question of, are the resources of the information available? But there's kind of a flip side of that, which I'm sure, almost everyone listening to this can see, like, well, anybody can chase Rob Latham, but I still got half the people, my security force in my department or whatever, that I'm not sure they can unload the gun without shooting themselves. Right. And so that's really that bridge, or that part of the industry that I'm focused on, is not so much the elite level. And obviously, if you're learning efficiently, it's going to help you get to the elite level faster. But really what I'm focused on is the armed workforce management side of training design, which is, how do I efficiently and effectively give competence to a group of people in a way that's predictable, right? Like, it's been, I think, almost accepted as sort of standard, right? Where when I'm running training for you, when we're talking about combatives or firearms or whatever, my main goal is to make you realize you don't know what you're doing, so you can go figure it out yourself and go train. And while I think there's a component of that, right? You're always going to be better if you go train on your own, right? You are always going to be get more out of training if you're really focused on it, right? The fact of the matter is that for most people, it is impossible to become competent within the organization's provided resources and training. If you just do what you do at the academy, and you just do your annual recertification or quarterly quals or whatever it is, if you do what your agency provides you, you will be incompetent, right? Unless you go out and you seek it on your own. And that's pretty much for, and probably not for everybody, but pretty much across the board with like firearms and combatives and emergency medical. You're not going to be able to do it for real unless you go train on your own, or at least not do it effectively. So within the resources and the training availability that is provided by the organization, and maybe not for everybody, but kind of aggregate across the board, this seems to be true. If that's all you have access to, you will not be competent at your job, right? And so I think that, to me, that is the structurally the thing that I'm really focused on being able to fix, right? And not from like how the training is run, but at a structural level. An organization that employs armed professionals should be capable of getting those people competent and maintaining their competency. It shouldn't be a paper tiger. It should be something that's legitimate and is real and that means something. And so coming up with the methods and systems and tools to allow that to happen within reasonable resource levels is the focus of what I'm doing, and is the focus of the company as well. Building shooters being the company.
What's the seemingly obvious answer would be just lack of resources, time, or money to make a competent shooter. But is there something a little deeper that people are missing?
Yeah. So if we basically superimpose how we train today, like kind of our standard models of training today, over how the brain actually works, you can see that we spend, like, of the limited resources that we have, we spend probably 90% of them at best non-productively. A lot of it, you can make the strong argument that's counterproductive, right? So I'm more more access to training time, more access to resources certainly always has the potential to be beneficial, right? If I train more, I'm typically going to be better. But there's another component of that, which is if I'm wasting 90% of what I have now, is more going to fix it, right? And I would really make the argument that there is no resource-based solution to the competency problem, because not everybody is going to become SEAL Team 6, right? Nobody's going to get 18 months of training before they get the opportunity to go do something, right? Like those levels of resources are never going to exist. Where people are shooting 70,000 rounds a year or whatever, right? New York Police Department, their officers are not going to shoot 70,000 rounds a year. And, I don't even think I can do math that high. I've started to count how many rounds you would need, right? But that's not to say that you can't use efficient and effective training methods that match up with how the brain learns, particularly if you get people at that entry academy level and make them into competent armed professionals that are able to not just maintain, but continue to enhance their skill set and their capability throughout their career. That is very much possible. And like I said, that's really been the focus of what we've been working on, since I've been working on it for about 20 years, but as a company since about 2016. Like I said, that first piece of it is that fundamental misalignment with how we deliver information to how the brain receives and retains information.
And what is that? How are we misjudging that? Because
Good question.
I think initial firearms training, you're thinking muscle memory, repetition,
right?
Practice makes permanent kind of thing. Like, what is it?
Yeah. So let's back out a little bit and talk about the brain as an information system, right? So when you get information coming to the brain, it's coming through one of your senses, right? So there's sensory input, and then every piece of sensory input goes through what is effectively a filter that your brain has, right? So if we had to process everything that we received, we would be overwhelmed and basically shut down, right? So we filter out, about 90% of what we get. Of that remaining 10%, it goes into what is called the short-term memory system. And so there's a couple of important parameters to understand about short-term memory. So the first one is that it's very, very small as compared to the rest of the brain, like extremely small as compared to the rest of the brain. If you look at the brain like a basketball, your short-term memory system is like the head of a pin, right? Like that sort of size differential. So it's very small, and it's also compartmentalized, right? So let's just say that I can, for example, put 10 pieces of information in the short-term memory, right? 10 discrete pieces of information in there. That doesn't mean that I can teach you 10 hand tool skills in one setting, because maybe there's only one slot in there that holds hand tool skills. The other, there's 9 more slots, but they're not compatible with hand tool skills. There's only one that's compatible with hand tool skills. Okay. So another thing that's important to know about short-term memory is that it operates very much like a computer's random access memory. So you can put stuff in there, you can process it, you can work with it, you can pull stuff out of it. But once you shut the computer off, right, or if you have to put something else in there, you're basically wiping out what's in RAM, right? So the information that's in there is not permanently retained, right? So if we think about a lot of our existing training structures, so for example, if you say, hey, we've got this directive, we need to get everybody patrol rifle qualified because we're supposed to give everybody an M4 or whatever to carry on patrol. So we're going to take everybody out. We're going to give them a 1-day class for 8 hours. At the end of it, they're going to pass qualification and they're good to go. What people should realize is that people are going to retain nothing out of that 8 hours because it's not possible. It's not neurologically possible to retain anything at the end of that training period. And so that's a good example of when I talk about how our resource allocation doesn't match up with how people receive, right? I can maybe give you, if we're talking brand new information to someone that's never handled that weapon system before, I can give you 15 to 20 minutes of new information, and now I've filled up your short-term memory system. So what am I doing for the next 7 hours and 25 minutes that I'm paying you overtime to be out there? I'm either I'm either corrupting the information that I gave you, or I'm overwriting it. And at the end of the day, you either learn nothing or you learn bad habits, right? Those are basically our two options in that sort of training structure. Again, I'm talking a brand new student, a guy that came out of 10 years in Ranger Battalion and is on your M4 day. He's going to have a great time, right? He's just getting tuned up. But for a brand new, but that guy also doesn't need really to be there, right? So for your brand new person, you're effectively wasting that 8 hours and whatever ammo you're spending. And so if we, again, back to the structure of the brain, I get stuff in the short-term memory, right? Let's say I've put things in the short-term memory. The only way they can be retained is if the brain looks at the information, decides that it's important enough to retain, and then takes that information from short-term memory and physically transfers it to a different geographic location in the brain and recodes it to another spot. Right? That's the only way that we actually learn anything that is retained for the long term. And so there's a couple things that are important to know about this, right? There's a variety of things that will help the brain realize it's important, right? Which is actually one of the main topics in the first book, Building Shooters. You have to sleep, right? You literally have to go into REM state because your body, or your brain cannot complete the transfer of the information until you go through a sleep cycle. And so the fact that we ignore all of this when we design and deliver training, right? And we do that based on sort of an assumption that I need to be in a high resource environment before I can run firearms training, or at least that's a major component of that, means that most of the resources that we spend are, right, I said, wasted, if not in many cases counterproductive. And so that piece right there, if we're able to fix that, where we can make huge headway on even just delivering people the fundamental skills.
That's really interesting. I was talking to someone earlier today and was kind of commenting about, you go to an 8-hour class, 8-hour post class, and then in 4 to 6 months, you're like, wait, what did I learn, or what was that thing that they said, or how was I supposed to? And that makes sense if you apply it that way. So if the model of going to an 8-hour class for that patrol rifle course is not the way, what is the way?
Yeah, so if you look at the structural method of how you can deliver information efficiently, right? So you figure out it's not the Bible, but there's a basic model in the book Building Shooters that shows how this works. So you say these are the parameters of what I can put in the short-term memory, right? I recognize that the first thing I have to do is get information through the filter, right? As an instructor now, right? So if you're looking at designing a training program, understand that as an instructor, you're going to get a room full of students. Let's say you want to communicate something to them and you're going to talk to them by doing it. So there's going to be several different versions of what happens. There's going to be what you think you said. There's going to be what you actually said. There's going to be what the student heard, what the student understood, and then what the student remembers, right? And 3 of those are happening individually for each person in the room. So there end up being a whole bunch of different versions of what you put out. Right. And so for you as an instructor to produce consistent results when if you got 10 students, that's 30 different versions of what you put out that the students are getting. Right. And then there's the 2, like what you thought you said and then what you actually said. It's very difficult to get consistent performance there. Right. And to get consistent results. So one of the most important aspects of delivering training in a way that the brain learns is you have to make sure that the information you're putting out is both consistent and that it gets through the brain's filter and actually gets into short-term memory. So let me back up and give an example, right? Like let's just keep this very abstract, right? If I were to go into a room and I say, I want everybody in this room to remember 1, 2, and 3, right? And so I say 1, 2, and 3 10 times, leave the room and expect, a week later, everybody's going to remember 1, 2, and 3. Well, this person over here didn't hear anything because they were concentrating on something else. This person over here only got 2, right? This person over here thought I said woo. This person over here heard 1, right? This person over here. And so I come back in 10 days later and nobody knows anything, right? Nobody has 1, 2, 3. And some people don't even have numbers, right? Whereas if I go in there and I say, okay, what I want you guys to remember is 1, 2, 3, we repeat it, they repeat it, I leave, we come back 24 to 48 hours later, even though everybody is still at that point where not even all of them recognize that we have numbers, right? But when I heard that we did numbers last time, there is still, the brain still has a residual imprint of the information that was put out. And so now when I go out and I put the information out again, when I actually teach the information, there's a much, much greater chance that I get through that filter and get in the short-term memory and I make a consistent message that actually makes it into that information processing system, right? Because when we teach people initially, if I just start out with brand new students and give them information, most of the information never even gets into the information processor, right? It just kind of bounces off and bounces around it. So the first aspect is called priming, right? And the way I describe that is you're going to teach people a discrete amount of information, which will match up with what they could get in the short-term memory, and you're going to have zero expectation that they'll learn it. Zero expectation whatsoever that they'll learn it. And you will find if you come back 24 to 48 hours later, most of them did not learn it, right? Which is really sort of a wake-up call to you. That was one of the things I noticed on the ship. Again, I had a bunch of sailors. Most of them have never touched a gun before. And so my first, it was like 45 minutes to an hour or something long lesson was loading and unloading the Beretta with dummy rounds, Beretta 92, the M9. And we did that for 45 minutes to an hour, right? And then practicing over and over and over again. They left, got those same guys back, 1, 2, 3 days later, and most of them couldn't do it. So from my experience there and other places, right? If you are trying to teach someone to load and unload a gun in one day, you will fail. They may be able to do it at the end of the day, but they won't be able to do it a couple of days later, certainly not 2 weeks later. Right? If you want people to receive the information and not just have it available in that temporary processor, but actually go into long-term memory, you have to follow the process of how the brain learns, right? So we prime, we come back and teach, and now the information's in short-term memory. I've gotten it there. I go through some things like repetition, creating an emotional connection, right? A couple other things that allow the brain to recognize that it's important. And then we got to back off and we got to let that information stabilize, right? Because the brain's actually going through a whole bunch of biological processes. It's synthesizing proteins. It's doing all kinds of stuff that's very chemistry related in the brain. So I have to let that happen. And then I have to let the person sleep, right? Because during sleep is a big part of how that information gets transferred over into the long-term memory system. And now the information is actually stored, not in a way that it necessarily can't go away, but in a way that it's less susceptible to corruption, right? And it is now stored in what is, a geographical long-term memory component. And now I can go work in this short-term space without losing or corrupting that information that I put in to begin with. So, my background mostly be like tactical skills and shooting and combatives, at least in the, anything that would relate to law enforcement. But pretty much everything that we do vocationally works on a series of building blocks, right? And everybody usually wants to go, I think Eric on the podcast, he said everybody wants to rappel upside down out of the tower and, shoot while they're running down the wall, but nobody wants to learn how to grip the gun. Right. And so we kind of had to have a tendency to try to give everybody everything at one time. When the reality is that most of what we do are skills that are very progressive, right? So what I mean by that is it had nothing to do with politics. If I'm drawing a gun and shooting it, I have to grip the gun as a component of the draw. And if I never learn to grip the gun, then I'm never going to have an effective draw stroke. And when I do draw the gun, I'm never going to have effective shooting at the end because I don't have a good grip. And I've never learned an effective grip. And maybe my grip is different every time. Maybe my grip's the same every time, but it's really ineffective, like whatever that case is. And so we spend a lot of time because we rush through and we try to do more than people have built the foundational building blocks for, that what we're doing is we're actually just corrupting their ability to learn, right? It's sort of like creating a corrupted data file where that's what's labeled grip and it's screwed up. And that's what's, the brain has learned. And it's now very, very difficult to replace it.
How many times have you damaged your gear while on duty? Chances are it's a lot. So why don't companies have a protection guarantee to replace gear that has been damaged in the line of duty? ComGear Supply is the first and only tactical communication company that has a line of duty warranty that will cover the damages to some of your most critical communication gear. Every month, ComGear Supply saves cops all around North America about $1,500 because they replace damaged gear due to cracked housing, pulled cables, water damage, and more. Me personally, I always pulled cables on my radio gear. From physical altercation to an accidental drop, ComGear Supply has you protected with that line of duty warranty. You can find tactical headsets, push-to-talks, earpieces, mics, and so much more in their line of duty collection. You can also check out gear from Auto, Silynx, Invisio, and other reputable brands at the best prices available. You can also check out gear from Auto, Silynx, Invisio, and other reputable brands at the best prices available. Find all-time favorites like the Noise Barrier Micros from Auto, or the XPR Push-to-Talk from Silynx. With year-round sales, tax-free prices, and free shipping, you're guaranteed to get quality communication gear at a fair price. Go to ComGearSupply.com right now and use that coupon code TheSquadRoom to get 10% off your order. Make sure you also follow them on Instagram at ComGearSupply and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Squadroom. After the riots and unrest of the summer of 2020, I began to get increasingly concerned about the fact that so much of my life is out there accessible to the public. I've been trying to figure out where that line should be drawn between what is shared on this podcast, on social media, or in interviews I give, and what should remain private for the security and safety of my family. Even though I'm a public person, that doesn't mean I want my personal information out there for the bad guys to find. I've arrested enough of them in my career that it makes me nervous to think my family could be exposed to those dangers. Not long ago, a suspect showed up at the front door of my partner's house 45 miles away from the station. I've had enough worry, but also I felt completely outmatched by the internet. I mean, it's the internet. Trying to take my name off of Google seemed insurmountable, and I learned that honestly, it is. But there's a lot we can do to protect ourselves, and that's removing our names from people's search sites and breaking the links between our home address and our names. I learned all this from my friends at OfficerPrivacy.com, who are here to help me clean up the internet and the paper trail that is my life. A quick Google search shows a shocking amount of information about where I live, where I used to live, my family members, their names, their addresses, and even phone numbers. We need help protecting ourselves from the bad guys. You have partners on your beat, so get a partner on the internet. Check out OfficerPrivacy.com for more information and learn how you can get started cleaning up the internet. I think we see that, we learn bad habits, or my experience, in my academy with firearms training, I hadn't shot a gun until the academy. And I heard it multiple times that I was the ideal student because I didn't have any hardwired bad habits in me.
Right.
And how some of the guys coming out of the military struggled because they'd just been ingrained with some bad habits. And that was really surprising to me.
Right.
And I'm, of course, not saying that, military guys are bad shooters all around, but there were guys who struggled with it. Then there were guys who were really good, of course. Right.
Right.
And it had a lot to do with how repetition, like you said, like the guys in my class who were infantry, pretty good shots, right? The guys in my class who were tank commanders or logistics or back office stuff, not as good because they didn't develop and ingrain a skill. So is the best way to develop a training system for firearms really this drip system over the course of time, and how go ahead.
Yeah. And not just for firearms, that's fundamentally how the brain learns. Mm-hmm. So what you'll see, there's a graph that I know we're looking at you guys aren't seeing anything. The audience isn't seeing anything. But basically what we do now is we give everybody this massive amount of information, right? And then it kind of dumps off. And then we spend the rest of our training program trying to get people to somewhere around where the qual is, right? Even though we've given them all this information, we try to get people's skills somewhere in here. And that's because we give them this massive amount of information and skill, or we put the information out, but they're not able to learn it. Mm-hmm. So with brain-based training, when you kind of do this drip, and give it to people very incrementally, what you end up with is it almost looks like you're not doing anything to start, right? You have a very, very, very slow, gradual growth, and then it becomes exponential as you get, it's right about the point where you have, with shooting specifically, where you basically learn the fundamentals of gun handling and marksmanship, right? So you've learned to draw, you'll learn to shoot, you'll learn combatively relevant visual skills, or however, I don't want to get into that discussion on here, but whatever aiming techniques people are using, learn some, basic mobility, reloads, clearing malfunctions, right? You've kind of learned those basic building block skills that are now ingrained as fundamentals, and I can now take those and apply them anywhere or in any environment. And so there's a couple things that happen. So the first thing is that what we've done now, even though this isn't explicitly in the building shooters model, it's in the book, right? Is that what you're doing when you do that is you're essentially creating this framework of long-term memory, which is actually, again, it's structurally in a different part of the brain than short-term memory. And so you can think of that like I'm building shelves, right? I'm building shelves in this long-term memory space, which say this has to do with drawing the gun. This has to do with trigger management. This has to do with recoil management. This has to do with, cornering or whatever, right? And so I've now built these fundamental skills that actually exist. And so now as I get new information as a student or I experience something, there's a place to go stick that that's already in long-term memory. And so a lot of the new learning, when you take an advanced student, right, or a student that it has this stuff, they're actually able to learn directly in long-term memory, and they can kind of short circuit this process that we have to go through for a brand new student. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is now I've kind of got these different, I like to call it dots, right? It's like connecting the dots at a certain point. I've got these little dots or touch points that I've built, and now I start connecting them and they start kind of networking together. And so you see just an exponential growth in skill set. Even though at the beginning of the training, it might look like we're not doing anything, right? We're on lesson 3 and we just got the dry trigger press. Like, what is going on here, right? But by, several hours later, all of a sudden people are shooting better and they're handling the guns better than people that have been doing it for a decade that have learned in different ways.
So that's a good transition then to like your newest book, Hitting in Combat. And I think the subtitle is Anything Any Cop Would Be Interested in Knowing, Full Tilt, the brain science of training to win gunfights.
Yeah.
The vast majority of the people who listen to this are active duty or have had firearms experience as a result of that.
Right.
And they're not the new shooter. Now that obviously
Right.
we have training cadres on here too, who are building these kinds of programs, academy instructors, etc.
Right.
And it's easy to understand, the implications for an academy, but for someone who's got 10, 15 years in,
right,
how do they start to adapt this into their own training? Because like you said, agencies aren't doing everything we need to make us into that 70,000 rounds. It's not their fault. It's just not possible.
Right.
But when we take it upon ourselves to go out and become a better shooter, what are the things we need to be mindful of, or that we can learn from your book about instituting those things in our own training?
Yeah. Good question. So, first, I don't believe it's necessary to get people to, we're going to do the 70,000 rounds to make them competent.
Right.
I think and I'm talking to the people that would be in a training cadre or administration or whatever here, right? Like, you can restructure how training is delivered, look at how you're implementing ongoing proficiency training, and without really adding training hours, but just changing the training structure, it completely changed the game. You're going to be playing a whole different sport, right? So let me start with that. So second thing I want to say, and this is extremely important for anybody that's actively working and carrying a gun, something you do not want to learn is that everything that you know how to do is wrong, and basically build this mental block to, I can't do what I know how to do. So let me give an example for this. I was in this back when I was a contractor, I was in this, training vetting program that we did that had some hand-to-hand stuff in it. And so one of this like testing scenarios that we did, this, this thing happens and this dude is like swinging a knife at you is how this starts. Right. And so I had done, like, back in, like high school and college, a little bit of martial arts, and I spent like a fair amount of time working on some spontaneous knife defense and, knife stuff. I'm not good with knives. I'm not a good knife fighter. You don't want to learn that stuff from me. But the point is that I had I basically had an instantaneous response to this knife coming at me, which was not what the instructors wanted to see me do. Right? It didn't necessarily make it wrong. It was just different. It was not what the instructors had as part of their approved techniques in this program. And so the response to that was they had 5 dudes come out from behind a curtain and pound me into the dirt. Right? I mean, literally just beat the tar out of me. I had they drag me out of the room and hobble around for a bit and then go back into my next scenario kind of thing. And so what did I learn from that? Right? I didn't learn their preferred technique because somebody came and beat me up because I did the wrong technique. What I learned was this massive, don't do that, which was the only thing I knew how to do. And so the next time that I saw a knife, which also fortunately happened to be in a training environment, what did I do?
I'm guessing you locked up, or you reverted to what you did.
Nothing. I did nothing. Yeah.
Right.
Which again wasn't because I had never learned to defend myself from a knife. It is because I had learned very effectively in this traumatic is not necessarily the right word, right? But in this high intensity training environment where there's a lot of stress chemicals and stuff like that. And what we can learn instantaneously in those kind of settings is what is effectively a traumatic association, right? So you touch a hot stove as a kid, you probably don't have to do that, an hour every other day for a month to figure it out, right? You do it one time and don't touch the hot stove, right? And so we can instantaneously get these traumatic associations. So what I learned was this skill that I have, right, which is my instantaneous response. I had this big blaring klaxon that said, don't do it because it's bad, right? And so what I ended up with, as I kind of look back on it, right, as I'm looking at this, dude chopping me up with this rubber knife, right, is I've got this response that I can't do because I know it's wrong, right? It's bad. And so anyway, so before I go on, anybody who's working, don't take anything I'm going to say here into this, oh my gosh, everything I know how to do is bad or something I'm doing is wrong. And then I can't do it, right? If you finish this podcast and you need your weapon in the line of duty or not in the line of duty, whatever, in 25 minutes, do what you know how to do. Right. So with that being said, so the way that the brain learns is it's not different just because you're trying to relearn something or because you're trying to change, right? And so there's 2 ways that I would break this down for someone that has been in for a while and been carrying a gun for a while and says, I need to fix myself. So the first one is I have a functional skill, but there's something that I need to tweak in it. Right. And so if you think about this, I mean, literally in the brain, what you're doing is you're going into that existing shelf, right? And you're changing out some of the books on that shelf. Okay. So that's one option. If you're, hey, I've got a hitch in my draw stroke, or my trigger press isn't great, or, whatever, right? I want to do a different method of trigger management or something. That's one level. A second level is I am just a football bat, right? When it comes to my firearm skills. And in that case, you don't really need to go work with that existing shelf. You need to sort of treat that almost like it's a pathology and build something new and turn it into a bypass, which then becomes your dominant response. So those are literally 2, and I can't sit here and tell each person where they fit on that spectrum, but it's 2 very, very different approaches to addressing I want to get better. Because there's I want to get better and I have a robust skill set and there's some things I want to tweak, which I can do within that existing set of neural networks. And then there is I've got this kind of useless spaghetti mess of crap and I need to create something new and let that old, basically that old skill set kind of die natural death by not getting used. And so this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in that knife example. that can be very, very difficult and frankly pretty dangerous to do for somebody that's actually actively out there working.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not giving anybody advice on an individual situation. I'm just trying to lay out, at least as I understand it, the terrain of how the brain works.
Sure.
If that makes any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think we're as we go through. Well, I'm seeing a change nationwide of as training cadres have access to more people like yourself and firearms instructors, and it there's always been like the older guys of the industry out doing the extra training sessions, the Mike Panones and whatever. But as they become more popular and as they become more accessible through social media or websites or podcasts or whatever it is, new ideas are getting adopted into our training methodologies, right? And I think in most scenarios it's good. And I equate it to, or I think most accurately, the best example of that would be going from shooting 5 on the 10 into a paper target versus integrating reality-based training. And you have a whole chapter in your new book on reality-based training, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as agencies are trying to get more creative, get more interest from their guys into more than just a static line shot. They try to bring in reality-based training, force on force or simunitions or FATs or any of those other things out there. But what are the things that we need to be cognizant of when we try to mimic a reality-based scenario training?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the things that I always hear trainers say, right, or when they come to me and talk about training, okay, I read your book, I really liked your book. And one of the things I hear a lot is, well, what I want to do is I want to get through the qual, right? Because everybody kind of goes, I got to do the qual, but I know the qual is not training. So I want to get through the qual. And then I want to put guys under as much stress and create as much realism on the range as I can, right? And so my question to them is always why? They say, well, because a gunfight is very stressful. And so I want to create stress in training and I want to make it as realistic as possible because that's what they have to train for. And I go, okay. So that's been kind of the thought forever, right? I used to have the same thought. So if we back up a little bit and we look at, really, I think we've already talked about all of this, or at least most of it so far on this podcast, right? Like if we want somebody to perform, right? So let's say, just pick something very abstract, right? Let's say I want to teach you, or I want to prepare you to avoid getting hit with a tire iron by doing some martial arts move or whatever, right? So if I took you out into the parking lot and hit you in the ribs with a tire iron, that would be very realistic training for getting hit with a tire iron. How much would that prepare you to disarm somebody with a tire iron? Right. And again, this kind of goes to the limits and goes abstract, right? But we don't learn when we're under tremendous amounts of stress. The only thing we can learn is what we already talked about, is a traumatic association, right? So if you take somebody and you put them into a very stressful environment, understand really what you're doing is you're changing the chemical composition of their brain tissue in a way that prevents information from being learned, except for immediate associative connections. That's the only thing that can happen under that brain state, right? That's going to be effectively a permanent learning. And so what's going to make somebody perform well at whatever it is, right? Whether it's gunfighting or punching or doing heart surgery or whatever, right? Are you going to be a good gunfighter because you spent a whole bunch of time under stress on the range, or are you going to be a good gunfighter because you can get the gun out of the holster and shoot somebody in the face? Which of those two things? Because I want to be clear, I'm not advocating against I'm not saying there's not a time for teaching people to recover from condition black, implement very realistic training environments, or implement stress. I'm not saying those are not useful training tools and that they shouldn't happen. What I'm saying is they have to happen at the right time. So if somebody doesn't have shooting skills, putting them under stress is not going to give them better shooting skills. And if they don't have the shooting skills to solve the problem, putting them in an environment where they cannot develop the shooting skills to solve the problem can't help them solve the problem. Right? Like if you can't draw the gun under no stress and shoot the standard of accuracy that's required to win your fight at whatever distance, if I put you under a lot of stress, it's not going to help you attain that skill level. Right? If I create a very realistic, hyper whatever environment, it's got all this whiz bang stuff going on. If I'm not doing anything to improve your fundamental ability to solve the problem, then, and all I'm doing is creating some unknown, because I can't predict it, right? As an instructor, potentially some unknown traumatic association with some stimulus in that environment. What am I really doing to you as an instructor? We don't know. We might find out in the real world, but we don't really know. Right. And so, I think this is something, I'm a huge supporter of reality-based training. It's got to happen. Right. And I'm not against stress in training. I just want people to understand what you're doing to the student when you put them into a simulated environment. Right. And so this is actually a part of a problem set that we've been working on since shortly after the publication of Building Shooters. In the book, one of the other new books titled Neuro goes through all of kind of the background and research on this. But what we did shortly after Building Shooters was published back in the 2016, 2017, is we sat down and said, all right, what are the fundamental components of the operational part of the job as it relates to being an armed professional? Right. And so we broke that down, not in terms of like tactical skills, right? Like door procedures or, whatever. But in terms of the actual neurological functions that go on. Right. And then we said, how do we develop those neurological functions and connect them together in a way that aligns with how the human brain learns? And how do we do that in a way that's cost effective? And so what we've been actually just had a call with a guy that runs an outfit called Tactical Neuroscience about an hour ago on this actually, is that we've been working really, really hard on a way to foundationally develop all of that relevant brain circuitry, right? And connect it together at the same time as we train, right? Starting like day one, week one, we're just working on dry environment, trigger finger management, and sight picture or whatever. We can integrate tactical visual skills, decision-making, de-escalation, and situational awareness, and all of those other neurological and physiological and brain processing functions that are required tactically, and we can integrate that and make it part of the shooting cycle, right, and part of the firearm skill, versus what we do now, where we develop these skills in isolation, and then we try to integrate all this stuff on the back end, which can work, but it's tremendously resource intensive. If we build it all together, it'll be far more effective for the student, and far less resource intensive to produce competent people.
You showed me something, you're working on some stuff around neuro.
Oh yeah.
And where do you see the future of firearms training going, particularly for law enforcement?
Yeah, really good question. So one of I think I mentioned before, the first fundamental failure is our failure to align training delivery with information reception. So that's what I see as the first thing. The second thing, and this really came out of after publishing Building Shooters, I was looking at what are the barriers to implementation of training methodology like this? Because there are real barriers, right? It's not like, I have a lot of people that are like, wow, like this makes sense to me, but I can't do it, right? Because it doesn't fit in my resource requirements or whatever. And those are real problems, and they're problems I've dealt with, right? As a trainer and as an officer, and, as a security practitioner too. And saying, what are these barriers to implementation, and how do we resolve them, or whatever? And the second one that I came up with, which I call the second fundamental failure, is qualification. Right. And I'm not, there's some people in the industry who are against qualification, and there's some folks that are, who I actually have a lot of respect for, who have like a one-shot qualification concept, like let's shoot one shot for quals and then go train. which I again, I have a lot of respect for those guys and I support what they're doing. I just don't agree with the approach, at least not systemically. I don't think it's effective. But so what we started looking at doing is how do we restructure qualification so that it becomes relevant and there's no difference between training and quals. They become the same thing. And so again, this is part of this system that we've been working on of how do we integrate visual skills, decision-making, situational awareness, de-escalation into our, both not only our training, but also into our qualification, and do it in such a way that it's, like individual price point tools, right? Like it is not a price barrier to anybody at any level of the industry, including, concealed carry people. And so as far as like what I see for the future of firearms training, I see two things. One, I see entry level training changing, right? People going through the academy instead of getting stuff dumped on them in a blocked manner, because that's just, the science is so overwhelming that doesn't work. I mean, there's mountains and mountains and mountains of science now saying that doesn't work. And so I think that's going to become more and more of an unjustifiable liability for any agency to use training that is demonstrably ineffective. So I see that changing, and that structure moving away from some of these assumptions that if we're going to do firearms training, we have to be in this high resource environment. We have to spend 8 hours on the range today, right, to get anything done. Because that's not only not true, it's like the opposite of true. Right? We're going to get less done on that day than we would have if we just spent a half hour in a classroom with new people, just teaching them how to lock the slide back on their Glock, right? Because most of them won't remember in 3 days. Mm-hmm. But next week they will remember, right? And now we're kind of on the pathway to getting proficient people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I see qualification changing, where we're moving away from aggregate scoring, where we are predefining skill sequences. So this is another thing that really actually gets into the neurology. So I kind of look at it, it's more than this, but to keep it simple, right? There's 2 different use cases, I guess, or 2 different sets, right? So there's the guy that like barely passes the qual and doesn't ever practice. Right. So that guy, this kind of doesn't really matter because he's not right. He kind of barely understands how the tool works. Right. Then there's the other people who are like, it's a qual. Like, it's not okay that I shoot 100% on the qual. I need to get more X's than everybody else on the qual. Right. Like actual X's. And so that guy goes out and he shoots the qual a lot. Right. And he gets better at the qual. And so what we do when we do that is we learn these predefined skill sequences, whether it be draw and fire 2 rounds or sidestep to the right and fire 2 rounds or whatever, right? Everybody's got their different yard lines that they shoot on their qualification. And so what this does, you do this a lot over time, right? Neurologically, what you do is you're basically, if you think of it like computer coding, you're basically writing a subroutine, right? So think of it like you're sitting down, you're writing code, and the code says, if this, then execute subroutine, right? And so when you say, right, you've now got this series of subroutines put together, which are draw and fire 2 rounds, or draw and fire 4 rounds, or draw 2 rounds, reload, or malfunction happens, I will tap, I will, rack, I will come up and I will fire 4 rounds, or whatever it is, right? You've created effectively these subroutines that you do over and over and over and over and over again. Well, neurologically, what that does when you do that in an environment that is absent of stimulus, right, and absent of decision making, and absent of networking with anything else other than that discrete, simple stimulus like a turning target or a buzzer, and this predefined skill sequence where you know what it is, you are now on that skill sequence. You're going into your conscious access long-term memory. You're getting this pre-known skill sequence, and you're running the subroutine to completion. Well, that is not what we want to do for real. Right. And so you do that enough and you've now created this isolated subroutine, which doesn't have the ability to stop it. Right. So from this may be a little bit overstated, but we're basically building programs that can't be interrupted once they start. Right. And so from the perspective of de-escalation, right, like I decide I need my gun, I'm bobbling, trying to get the gun out of the holster. And between the time I decided to draw and the time I fire the 3 rounds in the guy's chest, he's put his gun down. That looks horrible on a body camera, right? But for the reality is, for a lot of people, that's a subroutine that you are not capable of stopping, right? You're just running the subroutine to completion. And so the way that we train and the way that we qualify, they're really no fault of anybody's, just through the resource limitations we've always had, have pushed us into creating these things, right? Basically creating these pre-programmed subroutines. And so with that kind of science becoming more and more prevalent and some of the research starting to really bear that stuff out, I think that goes away. And I think we move to what I'm going to call scenario-based qualification, where we are integrating all of the relevant, information processing, decision-making, visual skills, and everything is all part of our, not just our training, but our qualification. We still have empirical standards, right? Particularly with this new tool set we're building. But you're not going in with a predefined skill sequence. And so the training for the test, the training for the fight become the same thing. And there's stops. We basically get rid of this barrier between training and qualification. They become the same thing.
Interesting. Dustin, you have almost a prolific amount of work out there for people to look at. We'll put links to all your books in the show notes to this episode, but where can people go to find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you. So if you go to buildingshooters.com, that's the easy website. I probably shouldn't say this because it won't be good for book sales, but if you look for a whole bunch of the content, not all of it, but a whole bunch of the content that's in the books you can get on the website. There's about almost 600 pages worth of articles up there right now. So I don't, there's an occasional one that's kind of like a clickbait deal, but most of them are really, really in depth. I don't really believe in doing fluff stuff. So yeah, people can go to buildingshooters.com for anybody, particularly active law enforcement. If there's something I can do to help you with looking at training design, I do a fair amount of that for folks, unless it's going to be like, 100 hours of work. I typically don't charge anything. So please feel free to reach out to the website. And I'll do what I can to help you.
Excellent. We'll, like I said, we'll put links to in the show notes to all of your places where people can reach out and contact you. It's a new learning modality that's totally counter to the way that we have done things. Right. Yeah. And it's another example of having to get over that prejudice towards doing things the way we've always done them, because it's just the way we've done them, and trying something new. So a lot of stuff to think about here. It's fascinating how the brain puts it all together. You really go in depth to it in the book on hitting in combat, and found it really interesting. So yeah, thanks for sharing with us today, Dustin. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Garrett. It's been a pleasure to be here.
All right, thanks for listening to this episode with Dustin Salomon of Building Shooters. Check out the show notes for all the links to his website and his socials and all that. All right, I want to offer you something that I'm very excited about. It's absolutely free. It's my Tactical Tuesday newsletter. It's a free weekly email where we bring you a few tactics, some tips, some strategies to help you succeed in the week ahead. Maybe a book I want to share, some gear I found useful, an inspiring quote, or anything else I think you'd like. To sign up for the Tactical Tuesday email list, you can visit thesquadroom.net/Tactical Tuesdays, or just text your email address to 805-364-2331. That's 805-364-2331. If you didn't catch that, it's in the show notes. You can check it out there. I promise that we won't sell or spam your email address. Just include your name along with it, and I'll add you to the list. And yes, those text messages come to me. It's not some like robot thing that sucks your information off the web. Before we wrap up, I have a challenge for you. If you got something out of this episode, if you were inspired by the conversation today with Dustin, I want to challenge you right now to take a photo of your podcast player as you're playing this episode, and I want you to share it with 3 friends, people who you think need to hear what we talked about today. Send them this episode and recommend they listen to it. And also, if you have time, please consider leaving a review on the podcast player of your choice. Please also leave a comment with your review. If you got a few seconds and a couple extra seconds to jot out some notes or some thoughts about the show, it really helps us expand our reach and bring these lessons to more cops who need to hear these things. Of course, join us on Facebook and on socials at the Squad Room as well. Special thanks to my sponsors for today, ComGear Supply If you're looking for the best prices and industry-leading warranty coverage on your radio equipment, make sure you check them out and use that coupon code THESQUADROOM, all one word, to get 10% off your order. Lots of other great companies support the show as well. You can learn more at thesquadroom.net/support. And until next time, take care of each other and stay safe.